Hi, I'm Mark, and welcome to another devlog for Block Strategy. Block Strategy is a single-player RTS game where you can place or destroy blocks to directly change the terrain of the world. And this devlog is going to be about what I think makes Block Strategy different from other RTS games, which is the concept of flaws and also my process in developing them and figuring out how they should work. So let's dive right in. So in most RTS games, you get the world, which usually doesn't change much, and you're essentially playing on a 2D plane that you look at from above. There are cliffs, which are heavily used in a game like StarCraft 2, but they're essentially a movement blocker and a one-way vision blocker, so the change in height is mainly a visual thing. When I first started creating Block Strategy, my world was similar, while also giving the player the ability to change the terrain because the world is made out of blocks. So you can place blocks, which changes the terrain and allows your units to move on top of them, but you can also mine blocks, which creates holes in the ground. And this got me thinking, what if I just keep digging? Well, initially, nothing. I'd just be making a big hole in the ground. But eventually, I got the idea to build a system of caves under the main floor. We'll call the main floor the overworld and the caves just the caves. So if you start on the overworld and you keep mining blocks downwards, you'll eventually dig into the caves. And the cave floor will have its own unique resources to collect, like these glowing crystals. And also, its own unique enemies, like these slugs that attack whenever you shoot the crystals. The purpose of these floors is to give the world more verticality, and to also allow the world above to be faded out when you're in the caves below. So the world now has two floors, the overworld and the caves. But that brought me to another thought. Why just limit the world to two floors? What if I wanted to build upwards from the overworld, or down past the cave floor? But before I got carried away, I had to think about how to program all of this. Let's go back to the overworld. As we know, the player has the ability to change the terrain by placing or mining blocks. Initially, whenever a block was placed or destroyed, the floors above or below that block would be recalculated. The way the calculation works is that it works down in a column of blocks from the top to the bottom. Whenever there's 2 blocks worth of empty spaces, which would be a walkable space for one of your units, then the block immediately below that would be a new floor. So the first block that's found in a column is floor 0, and if there's another block under that, then it's still floor 0. But if at any point there are 2 consecutive empty spaces or more, then the block below those empty spaces will be floor -1, and so on. Although this wasn't too taxing technically, it unfortunately produced some jankiness. For example, when you enter a lower floor, I always want the floors above to fade out so the player can see through them. But if you were to build a house with a roof, that would mean that the inside of the house is actually on the same floor as the cave system. So the game would fade out the roof, but also the overworld, allowing you to see the caves below the world. This obviously wasn't what I wanted, and if the player hadn't yet discovered the caves, then seeing them at this point would be confusing. I thought of a few ways to get around this. The first thing I tried was to only fade out a block if there's a floor below it in that column. But this was confusing as it was unclear what the current floor was, and whether you were looking at an uncovered cave or a valley. Another way I tried was treating the overworld and caves as their own special floors, and having all user-created floors essentially be sub-floors of these 2 main floors. So if you built a house on the overworld and went inside, only the roof would fade away and not the overworld outside the house. But it was creating 2 different systems for floors, which likely wouldn't have been as intuitive and led to a lot of weird bugs where the 2 different systems interacted with each other. For the sake of simplicity, I decided to make it so the game calculates the floors when the map is first loaded, and also when blocks are destroyed, but not when the player adds blocks. So let's say you start out on the overworld. All the blocks you add to this floor, no matter how high you go, will count as the same floor, the overworld floor. What this means is, if your unit goes under a structure that has a roof, the top of the roof won't fade out like it did before. You'll simply lose sight of your robot. You can still build walkways and other structures, but when the robot goes under them, you can't see it. While it's a shame to lose the fade out feature, I think this way of doing it simplifies things, and eliminates most of the jankiness. Something I want to experiment in future with is potentially having a bit of X-ray vision where you can see an outline of your unit when it's behind a block, but that's something I still need to investigate. So with the floor infrastructure in place, the next thing to think about is how the player would switch between the different floors. There are three major considerations when switching floors. Making sure everything visually fades out correctly, making sure units don't detect through the floor, so for example, a robot in the caves shouldn't detect an enemy in the overworld directly above it, unless it has line of sight with that unit, and lastly, making sure the fog of war is correct on each floor. So let's start with how the floor we're standing on fades out when we switch to another floor. To do this in Unity, I changed the layer of everything on the starting floor to a different layer that the main camera doesn't render. Basically, the starting floor is still there, but the camera doesn't see it. We'll also need to update the minimap. To be honest, I could probably do a whole video on the minimap. It takes at least 2 cameras to build it, but for changing floors we'll focus on just one camera, which takes a screenshot of the world from above. When the floor is changed, I turn on an overhead camera that renders all the blocks on the active floor to an image, and then I turn it off immediately after. Otherwise, we would keep recording everything that's happening, and it would be a huge performance hit. If a previous picture of the active floor has been taken recently, I'll load that instead of taking a new picture. This saves on performance, and also because we need to ensure the picture of the overworld was taken during the day. If it's taken at night, then you can't see much, and it's pretty useless. The next consideration when changing floors is to make sure the new layers work with existing scripts. So you need to make sure that player units and enemy units can still be targeted and damaged. If these didn't work, then you could go underground when your units are above getting hit, and the fight would just end, which would be a neat way to get out of a fight, but probably not the best mechanic for your game. So we need to allow everything on a floor that's been faded out to continue to be simulated even when we can't see it. Another issue is making sure your player units and enemy units don't detect each other when they're on different floors. As I said before, when one of your units is in the caves, you don't want it detecting an enemy in the overworld above it. But there is an exception to this, which is when your unit and the enemy are on different floors but they have line of sight with each other. So an example of this is that maybe your unit is in the overworld, but it's dug a hole through to the caves, and there's an enemy in those caves. If they can see each other, then they should be able to attack each other straight away, even though they're on different floors. To take this into account, I've made it so all units and enemies check their line of sights every second or so while they're in each other's detection range. This is done via array cast, which you can imagine as a beam coming out of each of the units into the unit that they're trying to detect. If that beam hits something that isn't the unit that it's trying to detect, then it doesn't have line of sight, because that thing could be a block or a tree or something else. If it doesn't hit anything and gets all the way to the unit it's trying to detect, then it has line of sight. The last consideration I needed to think about was the fog of war. I use an asset pack from Connect, which makes nice looking volumetric fog. It also has a fog of war system built in. I built my own manager which speaks with this asset and clears the fog around friendly units, as well as hiding enemy units that are in the fog. But this was a pain to get looking good when transitioning between floors. It's a funny story, I actually made a Reddit post a couple of weeks ago which showed off a transition between floors, and at that point I hadn't optimized the fog yet. You can see how janky it looks here, and I actually got called out on it looking janky, which pushed me to fix it. Basically what was happening was that the fog wasn't updating immediately, but over about 10 frames, and that 10 frames with lag was actually quite noticeable. Also, it isn't obvious from this video, but at this point the fog didn't take into account what floor your unit was actually on. So, for example, if you're looking into a cave but you have a unit above the cave on a different floor, then the fog within the cave would be cleared, which obviously doesn't make sense. Since then I made it so the fog completely resets when you change floor, and in that same frame clears the fog around your units that are on the floor. Units in another floor also now have no impact on the fog, as you would expect. Getting this working without affecting performance was really difficult, but worth it in the end as it now looks a lot smoother. But apart from the janky comments, I did have a good suggestion, which was to add a screen effect whenever transitioning between floors. So I've added a screen effect which appears around the edges whenever you transition between floors, that kind of adds a bit of a warping effect. I've also made it so the height of the camera changes when going between floors, just to give a bit more verticality to the movement. So that about covers it for floors. If you're still with me, then well done. And I'll just show quickly what it looks like in game now, the finished version. I hope that was a nice insight into what it takes to develop a feature, trying different things out, and when things aren't working, not being afraid to cut it for the sake of the overall game. If you have any comments or questions, then please leave them down below, and I'll either answer you directly or I'll answer them in a future video. And yeah, if you're not yet subscribed, then please subscribe. And if you've not yet wishlisted Block Strategy on Steam, then you can do that on the Steam page, which again is linked down below in the description. And yeah, that's all from me now. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.